Good morning. Thank you all for being here for this highly anticipated Atlantic Council front page event. I want to welcome our distinguished visitors here with us today, including many members of the Diplomatic Corps and our viewers watching online. I'm Steve Hadley, one of the Executive Vice Chairs of the Atlantic Council Board of Directors, and today I have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing the 20th U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Jamieson Greer. We could not ask for a better guest as we conclude this year of significant transformation of the global economy. As we look back on the first year of President Trump's second term, there's no doubt that trade and tariffs have dominated the economic agenda. The effective U.S. tariff rate has gone from 2.5% last January to above 15% today, the highest in 80 years. President Trump has set out to remake the global trading system, and Ambassador Greer has been at the center of those efforts. From Geneva to Madrid to Kuala Lumpur, over the past year, he has helped shape this new policy. This summer, writing in the New York Times, Ambassador Greer said that we are at the beginning of a new global trading system. He called it the Turnberry system, named after the resort in Scotland where the US-EU trade deal was brokered. He wrote, and I quote, "In the past, we subordinated our country's economic and national security imperatives to a lowest common denominator global consensus. This approach harmed American workers, their families, and communities by undermining a manufacturing sector that creates high-wage jobs, fosters innovation, and catalyzes investment across the country. What began at Bretton Woods as a necessary effort to rebuild a global trade system shattered by war evolved over 9 rounds of trade negotiations into something unrecognizable," unquote. The question we hope to answer today with Ambassador Greer, the question that animates our work here at the Atlantic Council, is what comes next. The Atlantic Council front page event series was created for conversations like these with leaders like Ambassador Greer. Before taking on his current role, Ambassador Greer served as Chief of Staff at USTR during President Trump's first term. In that role, he helped negotiate the Phase 1 U.S.-China agreement and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA. Ambassador Greer has had a distinguished career in private legal practice, focusing on international law and national security. He also served in the U.S. Air Force, in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, including a deployment in Iraq. Ambassador Greer, we thank you for your many forms of service to our nation. To moderate today's conversation, we are pleased to welcome Greg Hipp, Chief Economics Commentator at the Wall Street Journal. I'm sure everyone in this room and watching online agrees that Greg's analysis of the global trading system and his writing on the U.S. and Chinese economies are simply unmatched. Those of you joining us today will have the opportunity to join the conversation, asking questions via askac.org. Before I turn the floor over to Greg, let me note that today marks the 5th anniversary of the founding of the Atlantic Council Geoeconomic Center. It was created thanks to the vision of Chairman John Rogers to help define the shape of the new global economic system. Through its new tariff tracker and its data-driven work on trade, digital currencies, China's economy, sanctions, and more, it is doing precisely that. We could not ask for a better event to mark this milestone. Ambassador Greer, the Atlantic Council floor is yours, and Greg, over to you.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and thank you everybody here, and Ambassador Greer, thank you so much for coming today. Now, I've known you for a while, and I know that you keep a busy schedule, but even by your standards, it's been exceptionally busy. I understand that this is actually your third meeting of the day. You've already met with delegations from Jordan and the UK. I'm also understand that there's an AI avatar of you out there with a song put to your tune. So do you think that in the future you'll be you'll allow your AI avatar to take over some of the negotiation?
Maybe that would allow me to multitask.
That's right, yeah, and catch up on your sleep. Look, I want to start out by going back to a speech you gave in Detroit at a reindustrialization summit. And in that speech, you laid out, some of the goals of the Trump administration's trade plan, and you also laid out a three-part test, three things that you thought would tell us if you were achieving what you wanted to. They were smaller goods trade deficit, higher median real incomes for households, and rising manufacturing share of GDP. I want to ask you, give us a report card. How has the agenda, how is it delivering so far, and what more do we needs to be done?
Thanks, and thanks for having me today. Thank you to the Atlantic Council and to Adrian Arch for your continued patronage here, and for the audience. The president has a great line where he says, a lot of you I really like, and some I don't like as much, and I'm not going to tell you who. I have a reputation for liking everybody, so I'll just lead with that. With respect to the report card, I give those metrics when I'm talking about our goals in the administration and at USTR. The goal is not to simply have a trade deal or simply to have tariffs for tariff's sake. It's to have a trade policy that leads to these kinds of outcomes. So where are we on all of these? The trade deficit. Right now, the trade deficit globally is tracking higher than it was last year. Why is that? Well, there were a lot of people front-running the tariffs. All right, they knew this was going to happen. So if you look on a monthly basis, early on, we had higher imports than normal. People were front-running the tariffs. If you look since August, we've seen a significant decrease. Notably, our bilateral trade deficit with China has continued to decrease. It'll be down by about a quarter this year, I think, if it continues at this pace. So overall on the year, of course, it's going to, the first half of the year is going to track a little bit what happened last year and the front running. But when you look at what's happening more recently, it's clearly going the direction we want it to go and we expect it to go. Second, on wages, blue collar wages are up. So we're seeing the right direction there. And then on the last one, manufacturing, the share of GDP, it's about the same. Some folks measure it a little less. What I would say though is we're seeing a lot of positive numbers there, and you have to forgive me. I actually just brought the numbers because I can't remember everything. I can remember a lot, but some of the metrics I'm looking at are shipments of core capital goods, which rose to an all-time high in July, remained high in August, remained high in September. Real private fixed investment was 5.7% in the first half of the year. 2024 is about 1%. So some of those indicators of new investment, more capital goods, construction of new factories and facilities is also up by a large percentage. So all of those are going the right direction that we want. I think we'll see it show up in early next year. Secretary Bessent said the same thing. We also have accompanying the trade policy are good tax policies, energy policies. We're pumping more oil a day than we ever have. We have expensing in the One Big Beautiful Bill that's going to help folks with their capital equipment and things like that. So a lot of the indicators we're looking at are going exactly the right direction.
Manufacturing employment has been weak this year. I think it's been down in the last few months. What do you make of that? Is that a sign that the reshoring has yet to happen?
Well, again, it's something we track, and we're aware of those numbers, of course. And I look at it in the broader context. Some of the figures I just talked about, more capital equipment, more construction, more private fixed investment. Those are all good numbers. The employment numbers overall are interesting because we have this phenomenon as well of the administration's immigration policies, really changing the fundamental employment numbers in the United States. And I'm looking into that, honestly, because I see that number and it seems a little out of step with what we're seeing in the other numbers. So we're watching that. I mean, it's not been a huge drop, but obviously we want it to be higher.
Last night in Pennsylvania, the president talked somewhat about his tariff plan. And one line that caught my ear was that he talked about, I think he said something about how we don't need 35, so many pencils pencils and Barbie dolls, and he said this in the past, but explain to us the theory of the case about reshoring. Is it the case that we want to bring back the production of everything, including pencils and dolls, or does the administration have an overarching theory about which manufacturing is most important to bring back?
Sure. The first thing I'll say on, Christmas and all of that, we had the National Retail Federation vice president come out, recently and say stores are stocked up and ready for a record holiday season. So I think I'm not the Grinch just yet.
No doll shortage.
No, there's no shortage.
We're hearing from. Okay.
What I would say is manufacturing, and not just manufacturing, but the associated research and development, it moves in ecosystems. And so when you're focused on reshoring the things that matter most, automotive, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, robotics, steel, fertilizer, all of these things, you tend to naturally get a lot of other manufacturing that comes along with it. Could that be toys and pencils, et cetera? I mean, we've made those things here before. And by the way, manufacturing jobs in America on average pay more than services jobs. We talk a lot about services jobs and how great they are, and they certainly are. Yeah. But manufacturing on average pays more. So I don't think we should turn up our nose at making pencils in the United States or other things. I don't know if American Girl is made in America. It says American Girl. Trust, I have 4 daughters, so I've got these things. So what I would say is I'm not turning my nose up at this other manufacturing. I think all manufacturing jobs are good jobs, and they typically feed into the broader ecosystem.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the agenda. I think last week you had a series of hearings on USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada agreement, and I believe the treaties or the agreement says renegotiation must begin sometime in the coming year. You were, of course, a part of the team that negotiated that treaty back in 2018. What are the flaws that have since become apparent to you, and what do you want to fix? What's your priority for altering or fixing this agreement?
So one of the things we really wanted to do with USMCA, and remember, when you look at North American trade, you have big sectors. You have automotive, transportation, and everything around it. You have energy trade. You have agricultural trade. You have other important sectors too. You have services trade. But those drive a lot of trade in North America and in the United States. And remember, it's a $31 trillion deal, 29 trillion of which is the United States when it comes to GDP. And so in the first term, we were quite focused on securing and improving ag access, because I think a lot of our agricultural producers were big winners of the North American economy. On the automotive side and related manufacturing, that was more challenging, where we saw a lot of that production go to Mexico and also to Canada. And a lot of people will say, well, that was the point. We wanted to have lower wage manufacturing in Mexico. But if you go back and look at the history, the narrative around NAFTA was, well, it's actually going to raise wages in Mexico. We're going to export more because they're going to buy more from us. So it played out quite differently than how it was sold. What we did there is we changed the rules of origin. We wanted to incentivize more content from North America, particularly from the United States. One of the drawbacks is that the most favored nation rate for automobiles in America is 2.5%. And so we had a very narrow range to play with where we wanted to incentivize more production in North America, but we only really had 2.5% to play with. And that's a problem. If our MFN rate for autos had been 25% like it is for pickup trucks, it's a lot easier to create incentives to produce in America. We make a lot of pickup trucks in America. It's because of that 25% chicken tax, as it's called. So one of the things we've already done in this administration, as you know, is we've imposed the Section 232 on autos. We've, to some degree, fixed that. I think going forward with USMCA, we need to look at non-auto rules of origin to take a similar approach, especially now that we have the reciprocal tariff overlay in Section 232. I think we have more incentives to create more U.S. and North American content.
Do you have a view on whether this is best done trilaterally, as was done last time, or that it's best done as 2 separate bilaterals?
Well, our economic relationship with Canada is very, very different than our economic relationship with Mexico. The labor situation is different. The import-export profile is different. The rule of law is different. So it makes sense to talk about things separately with Canada and Mexico. We have the underlying agreement. There are certainly areas where...
When you say underlying, are you referring to CUFTA, the one that preceded NAFTA?
Well, I'm talking about USMCA.
Oh, okay.
We have USMCA, which is a trilateral agreement. My sense going forward is we're already talking to them separately.
Sure.
I have not I have not had a meeting this year where I sat with Canada and Mexico in a room and we sat together and talked about USMCA.
So it sounds like, if I could sort of infer what you're saying, is that, yeah, we could end up with simply two rather than one agreement.
You could have a couple of protocols attached to the agreement. You could have a replacement. I mean, there are a lot of things that you could do. Now, there are going to be certain areas where a trilateral discussion could make sense. Rules of origin being one of them. Do we align on external trade policies to some extent? That could be another one. Critical minerals could be another area.
Under this scenario, does USMCA plausibly go away altogether and is simply replaced by new agreements?
So we put, and Congress agreed to have this sunset review clause. And the whole purpose was to review, revise, or even exit USMCA. That's the purpose, because NAFTA did not have such a clause. And so for 25 years, it persisted without change, without a driving factor to force political accountability for the deal, and it lost political support over the years to the point where presidential candidates from both parties regularly would run against NAFTA when it's fully in the power of the U.S. government to change this and revise it. So we put in the forcing function. So, could it be exited? Yeah, it could be exited. Could it be revised? Yes. Could it be renegotiated? Yes. I mean, that is the purpose of that clause, and all of those things are on the table.
Do you anticipate submitting the finished product to the Senate for ratification?
So if you have something where we require an adjustment to U.S. laws, then you have to go to Congress. That's just how it works. If I have a situation like with some of our reciprocal trade agreements that we're doing where there's not really a congressional change to be made, and it's mostly just changes on the other side of the table, you don't necessarily have to go to Congress. Now, all that being said, go to Congress. We consult with them. I was there last night in the hearing. Our people talk to them all the time. With respect to a vote, if we need to have a vote to change something in U.S. law, of course we're going to go to Congress.
Okay. Let's turn to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. As you know, there's a case pending in the Supreme Court.
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah. That's right, yeah, because you've been reading the Wall Street Journal, I would hope, yes. On the legality of this thing. So there is, I'd say the betting markets are saying that the Supreme Court will rule against you. What's your contingency for dealing with that situation?
So I would say that since the first term, President Trump and the policy people surrounding him have been thinking about ways to achieve his goals with respect to trade. And even this year, in January, when we were preparing the America First trade policy and options for the president to decide from, there are many statutory delegations that Congress has granted to the president or to agencies to take action. Now, remember, the Section 232 actions on steel, aluminum, autos, et cetera, those aren't at issue in the case. So all of that stays. The question is, imposing the global tariff and ensuring that the biggest offenders when it comes to trade deficits and unfair trade practices are addressed. And you have a lot of familiarity with Section 301. Obviously, I've referred to Section 232. There are people out there talking about Section 122, which is a balance of payments power, and the courts have even talked about Section 122. So all of this is kind of in the ether, and people are talking about it. I'm under strict instructions from my general counsel not to reveal the backup plan.
So the Atlantic, they have a lovely visual, and I hope you can put it up right now, showing the IEEPA tariffs versus the 232 tariffs. Can we get that picture put up somewhere? Oh, there we go. So as you can see, by their estimates, the IEEPA tariffs are raising an annual run rate of around $200 billion a year. That's a lot of money. Do you think that you can basically recreate that revenue stream using alternative instruments?
Yes.
Yes? Is that
short answer, but yes.
Is that in fact one of the policy goals? Will it be one of the considerations?
I mean, listen, tariff revenue is a byproduct of the policy. And you've heard the president talk about it a lot. And as this group knows, I think, and anyone who follows trade, the default position for a long time in the United States was to raise revenue to fund the government, and then we switched to an income tax early in the 20th century. So it's not crazy to have revenue helping to fund your government, and a lot of countries actually still do to this day. So it's certainly a byproduct of the policy. The policy The policy is to reshore the things that matter. It's to get our trade deficit down.
Yeah.
It's to raise real income, all those things I discussed.
Well, the reason I bring up the revenue is that's in some sense a proxy for the tariff burden or the tariff incidence, right? I mean, divide the tariff revenue by the imports and there's your rough proxy, right? So what I'm trying to get at in that question is, do you think that you can create more or less the same tariff incidence, the same policy outcome using alternative instruments?
I mean, so I would say roughly yes, and here's why. Because
and is that something that would be under a consideration? Would that be one of the policy objectives that you think about in that contingency?
I am focused. Here's what we're focused on: getting the trade deficit down. So when you look at where we are right now, what does the trade landscape look like? The countries that have the largest surpluses with us and the world and have the largest problems with overcapacity or subsidization, these are largely Asian countries, but even the EU has a giant surplus with us. Those countries currently have the highest tariffs, right? China has an all-in rate of, about 45 if you add the 301s and what we've done this year. Southeast Asia is high rates, 18, 19, 20%. And then we have a variety of, closer allies that we trade with, but with whom we have real trade problems. This is Japan, Korea, EU. I keep pointing here because the EU ambassador is right there. And then when you get to the Western Hemisphere, we're generally at about 10%. This is our backyard, and we have surpluses with these countries. The reason why some of those countries have a higher tariff is because they have a variety of unfair trading practices that they pursue. And so I'm confident that with other tools we have related to unfair trading practices, we can produce the tariff rates we need.
If in the event the Supreme Court also orders a refund of tariffs paid, do you anticipate any difficulty in actually facilitating or advancing those refunds? It's a lot of money. Could the people who a lot of companies have lined up asking, preparing to ask for their money back, how long would they have to wait?
Well, it is a lot of money. And I mean, this is part of the reason why the president's been so vocal about this case. Obviously, he wants to have the leverage that is afforded by IEEPA to be able to take care of the emergency we're facing in offshoring and manufacturing and the deficit. And he's raised this point too, right? You leave a hole in our finances if you do this. So it's a big deal, right? And hopefully the Supreme Court follows the plain language of the text, which is in our favor. One fortunate thing, and this is probably the only question I'll dodge, is I'm the USTR, I'm not CBP, I'm not the Treasury Department, and so I'll refer you to Secretary Besson. But I had the Commissioner of CBP in my office yesterday, and we were talking, and obviously people think about how this might work. I don't know what the timeline looks like, though.
So don't expect them to thank you for basically telling us to go ask them the answer to that question.
Well, they send people to me all the time.
Okay, so. Fair enough. You mentioned the EU ambassador. Obviously, we're still sort of, I think, working on some of the details there. Your colleague, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, recently suggested that, for example, the outcome on steel and aluminum tariffs might depend on the treatment of U.S. tech companies. There was recently a very large fine imposed on X, and I think that obviously creates some friction. Are those two things linked in your view? Will how the EU essentially implements their various digital legislation have an affect how they are treated in tariff negotiations?
In our joint statement from the past summer, which was really important, right? And Stephen Hadley referred to our statement and what happened at Turnberry. And it was an incredible moment for the EU and the US to agree to look at the facts on the ground and say, listen, there are other things going on in global trade that maybe aren't accounted for by the current system, and we need to address them, and we'll do it together. So I give huge credit to President von der Leyen, her staff, and everybody for being super pragmatic on that point. In that joint statement, there is language about no discrimination against U.S. digital actors and making sure that they have fair treatment. You won't be surprised to know that what we think is fair treatment, what they think is fair treatment, is quite different. And I've been frankly disappointed over the past few months to see zero moderation by the EU and its implementation of the DMA and now the DSA. I don't purport to control any other country's regulatory schemes or their sovereignty or anything like that. I understand that. But with respect to our companies, we're going to regulate our companies. The challenge with the digital trade space is that due to the nature of the internet and digital trade itself is it transcends boundaries. And so if you have one jurisdiction that says, well, we're going to impose this super draconian set of rules, or we're going to limit your business models in certain types of ways, because these are naturally cross-border companies, it affects them everywhere, right? This is the equivalent of California setting the emissions rules for cars for the whole country, right? For what they do, right? The EU is essentially trying to do it, for global digital operators. And it would be one thing if they had their own champions, right? But they don't. So it's a real problem. And by the way, we haven't even quite settled this in the U.S., right? There's a lot of discussion in Congress and among policymakers on how to do digital tech regulation, and people are a little bit all over the place. What I will say is we're not going to allow that regulation to be outsourced. And so I'm hopeful we'll have constructive discussions with our friends in the EU on this.
Yes, it's been observed that the one thing the Europeans export a lot of is regulation, so it looks like they might need to find some different comparative advantage.
This is why they gave the EU ambassador a front row seat right here. Hear this again.
Going back to the revenue situation, how do you feel about going to Congress and saying, let's legislate some of these tariffs. Let's go and amend the harmonized tariff schedule to create some permanence to this revenue stream?
Yeah, I mean, listen, if I were Congress, I'd be quite interested in that. I've had members of Congress come up to me who I would not characterize as fans of tariffs, but they've said things like, this is real money. This is real money. We have actual priorities. We'd be interested in legislating. I've had people come up and say, we understand exactly what you're talking about when it comes to the supply chains that we need to reshore and the trade deficit we need to get down. Why don't we legislate some of this? So I've had some interest. We've had discussions in the White House about the viability of this. Obviously, any bill like that is really challenging, and I've been in Washington long enough to be jaded at the prospect of legislation. But I think it makes sense. I think that it would provide a new baseline for companies to understand, this is not just President Trump or maybe the one person who comes after President Trump, but it truly is a bipartisan expression of what I think a lot of people agree with.
So could that involve, for example, raising the MFN tariff, which I believe is the first schedule?
Yes, I mean, my own view is if I were Congress, I would want to have something like, a global baseline to help get the
10%,
for example, to get the deficit under control, and then you have higher tariffs based on, whether it's the deficit or unfair trading practices or something, and you give the president enough discretion to adjust that to incentivize countries to, come into the fold.
There's even been interest, and I think there might actually been a bill in Congress on creating a separate China tariff schedule. Is that something you'd be interested in?
I guess my view is you don't need something China-specific if you have a broader kind of global approach, right? You can fold whatever your approach to China would be into that same legislation.
Okay. One thing we hear a lot about, and we at the Journal hear a lot about from our business readers, is complaints about the complexity, the uncertainty, the compliance burden of tariffs. Tariffs have changed a lot this year, and there's a lot of interaction, between the different, for the 232s, the 301s, the IEP tariffs. There's questions, do they stack, do they not stack? There are anecdotes out there of like an importer getting 3 different quotes on what tariff they raised. And there was a Fed study that suggested additional compliance costs are roughly equal to a tariff of like 1 to 2.5%. So do you agree complexity is an issue? And if so, what's the solution? And can American businesses look forward to a period of stability?
So I'm sensitive to the complexity question because I'm an international trade attorney, and in my private life I spent many years helping navigate what's already a complex system, by the way. So let's level set, right? It's not like before this it was like all roses and hugs in customs world. It's always been quite challenging. But we are sensitive to this. So early on, there were questions about stacking. How do you relate 232 to the reciprocal tariff? And so there was guidance and executive orders to help clarify that. And as a general matter, if something's under the 232 regime, that's where it is. If it's under the reciprocal tariff regime, that's where it is. There's some exceptions to that. I understand on steel and aluminum, there are derivative products, and there's some complexity there. We've heard from that on a lot of folks. So the goal is not to introduce complexity for its own sake. Naturally, when you are moving trade policy that's been more or less the same for 70 years to a new outcome, and you're changing the tariff regimes, there's going to be challenges with in making it operational, right? It's one thing to kind of have big ideas at the administration level, but again, I had the CBP commissioner in my office yesterday, and we discussed this very issue. So we're committed to making it as smooth as possible, and so we're very open to feedback on complexity.
By the way, if the Atlantic Council people, I know they had a slide they wanted to show. It's really cool with a slider that shows the changing tariff levels. That you feel free to put it up now if you have it, but that sort of like visually explains how much tariffs have changed. And so now you could say, wow, that's a great, like piece of work product there. But if you were in your old job, you'd be like rubbing your hands at all the work this creates, I'm sure. But anyway, I get what you're hearing, and I presume that you've got a lot. It looks like a lot of the heavy lifting has been done in terms of just rebuilding and reframing, restructuring the system. All else equal, will 2026 be a quieter year than 2025 on tariffs?
Well, that's a question for President Trump.
Okay.
but what I would say is, and I see the graphic, and obviously, again, we're in the middle of a project, and so you're going to see things changing over time. And there's a lot of focus on, April 2 and Liberation Day and things that happened since then. I would really focus on August 1st, because that is when the president really set in place a lot of what the reciprocal tariffs were going to be. We announced a bunch of deals, and then in the couple months since then, we've kind of fleshed out what those deals are. And you've really seen, the structure play out that I talked about, right? The highest, overcapacity, trade deficit countries with the highest rates, and the farther you get away from that, the lower the tariffs are. I mean, that's the structure. There are outliers, Brazil, India. Yeah. We're working on that.
I want to turn to China now, and I believe you have a visual also that shows some interesting patterns in the trade between the United States, China, Mexico. So this is interesting. As you pointed out, we're seeing the big drop in the China number and divergent behavior, but China now drops to third place in terms of its importance as a supplier to the United States. And I bring that as background because I think that one of the things that has been remained constant between the Trump first term, this term, and even the Biden term in between was the view that China is different. And when I read the national security strategy, and I understand you contributed to this, right? Did USTR actually had some role in helping draft the national security strategy?
We got to see it and give input.
Okay. So I'm just going to quote a little bit from it. We must work with our treaty allies and partners to counteract predatory economic practices, use our combined economic power to safeguard our prime position in the world economy, and ensure that allied economies do not become subordinate to any competing power. It discusses encouraging our partners to rebalance China's economy toward household consumption, forming coalitions that use our comparative advantage, to pursue growth through managed cooperation tied to strategic alignment. So conceptually, all of this seems to be pushing us in a direction where whatever other differences, the United States and its like-minded partners would benefit from a common approach to China. Is that true? And how do you actualize it? Can you talk about how the United States can actually, given there's been a lot of tension and a lot of friction between our partners, given all that, how does the United States, or should the United States even want a common approach towards China?
Yeah, so first of all, I think, I would characterize our view on China, and I've mentioned this, recently, so it's not news or something. People in Washington like to talk about China hawks and China doves, et cetera. That's a distinction that doesn't really resonate with the Trump administration because we're just pro-American, right? We're just pro-American. We're not anti-anybody. We're not, we're pro-American. America first, as they say. So first of all, that's our position. I think it is, and we hear this sometimes when partners say we should align on China. Oftentimes that is code for don't put tariffs on me. Yeah. Right. So that's like its own thing. I mean, my own view is it's in every country's interest to take action against overcapacity and distortions, whether that's from China, or whether that's from Vietnam or Indonesia or other folks, right? Or, we talk about the EU. We have real issues with some of the EU's, regulatory approaches. So, we're not really in a position of telling everybody you're either with them or you're with us. I mean, that's really not how it is. I mean, our view is the United States has taken a lot of unilateral actions over since the Trump administration. The Biden people kept a lot of this. We're doing things now. A lot of it has to do with China simply because we have a giant deficit with them and their economy doesn't fit in very well with ours. We're just quite different economies. Doesn't mean we can't trade together. We should trade together. I mean, I think the landing zone with China is really, we just have more balanced trade. I think we have to manage it. I think we have to talk to each other about what we do want to buy and sell from each other and just make it, frankly, quite managed. Is that ideal? Not for a capitalist, but we aren't dealing with capitalists on the other side. I think with respect to other countries, I think a lot of it is organic, right? You can see other countries already taking action against overcapacity, whether it's from China or elsewhere. I think it's not really a situation where you have like the Justice League coming together and doing all this. This is not how it is. We're taking unilateral actions. It always takes longer for other countries to get behind it or do things, and I understand that. Everyone's different politics and policies. If we align in a way that helps America, great. If not, we're going to take our own actions.
So we learned just this week that China ran a trade surplus, I think, of $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion, just through the first 11 months of the year, an all-time high. There's growing concern, we wrote about it this week in the Journal, that China's export-driven model is actually hurting other countries by deindustrializing them. And so that essentially so where that's heading towards is that it's the China challenge is not strictly a bilateral challenge, it's global. And we can try and keep out China's exports bilaterally, but they'll find some other home somewhere else, and it will redound to the United States some way. And this brings folks to the idea that there's some value in this common approach. And I noted, for example, in the Malaysia deal, there's a section there that obligates Malaysia that if the United States imposes restrictions on a third country, such as China, Malaysia must sort of copy those. So what's the driving thought behind that? And is there some willingness to consider, for example, in USMCA, maybe Canada and Mexico sort of mimic the American external tariff on China in exchange for maintaining some of the preferential access in that agreement?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's really important to acknowledge that President Trump is very focused on having a constructive relationship with China. We certainly had tensions earlier this year. And when China really escalated the situation through rare earth controls and all these different things, the United States certainly had an option to elevate our own export controls or other things. We have a lot of leverage, over all kinds of China and everyone else. But the president's interest is not in blowing up everything, right? And that includes our relationship with China. And so we're quite focused on trying to find a path forward to have an exchange of goods and services between China and the U.S. that makes sense for both of us and that is fairly balanced. Now, you referred to some of the provisions we have in our trade agreements with Malaysia and agreements from others. It makes sense in a bilateral trade agreement to want to ensure that the benefit of that agreement goes to the two parties involved, right? And that helps us control all kinds of things, control for transshipment, et cetera. And if you're ever in a situation where we think that broader action is necessary with regards to third countries, and it's not China specific, right? And if you look at the agreement, it doesn't say anything about China specifically. You have that option. You have that option to be able to go to countries and say, listen, you agreed to work with us on these issues, and we're seeing an effect in your market that affects us. I mean, that's a pretty, I think, a normal and natural thing. I think saying it out loud is new. I think writing it down is new, and I think it signifies the importance of economic security. That's all new, and I think we should be commended for it. Again, I think it's there if we need it. Right now, we're really trying to have a constructive relationship with China.
Okay. I'm being told that I need to start asking the audience for questions. There's a few other things I wanted to ask, but any questions? Okay. My friend Gavin Bade from the Wall Street Journal has a question.
Moderator's prerogative.
It's kind of a plant.
He doesn't know what I'm going to ask, I promise. Ambassador, thanks for being here. I appreciate it. As he said, Gavin from the Journal. I wanted to ask you about some recent recalibrations in some of these IEEPA tariffs. You all rolled back some tariffs, especially on foodstuffs recently. Some of that was in relation to trade deals or agreements that you signed with some nations, but some of it was outside of the trade negotiations. I wanted to ask you why you've recalibrated in that way. And is there kind of a tacit admission there that maybe some tariffs were applied to some goods that, had raised prices for consumers in a way the administration didn't want to see going forward?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to stuff like coffee and bananas and stuff like that. And so from the outset of these negotiations, at least internally, there'd been a view that there would be calibrations at some point. And some of these tariffs you have because you want to reshore, you want to protect, you want to take care of the deficit, and some you have for leverage. And so in early September, the president put out an executive order saying, listen, here's a bunch of stuff where we can, I'm going to authorize USTR and Commerce and all these folks to eliminate the tariffs contingent on progress on the deals. And so, a couple months later, after we had announced deals, a swath of deals in Asia, obviously the EU, other places in Europe, Western Hemisphere, et cetera, we were in a position to feel like we finally had really had a critical mass of progress that we could remove the tariffs on these items, which he'd been signaling he was going to do, and several weeks later we did. It's no coincidence that when we announced deals with Ecuador and Guatemala and Vietnam and Cambodia and these places where we get banana and cocoa and coffees, like there's just no coincidence that we announced these deals and then we released this stuff. With respect to the incidence of tariff increases, I mean, listen, there's a lot of stuff that goes into pricing. If you look at coffee, the coffee price had been going up for 2 years, right? I can't control the weather in Brazil with a tariff. That being said, I think it's more likely that you have a tariff incidence on a price for something that we just don't make in America than something we do make in America. Also, when you think about the incidence of tariffs, you often get a situation, particularly with manufactured goods or commodities that are broadly produced. If you're trying to sell into the most valuable consumer market in the world, you want to keep your market share, and so you're going to compete with other exporters to eat the tariff. And so that's why you see the tariff effect really diffuse throughout the supply chain.
There is yes, right here. Introduce yourself, please. Wait for the mic and then introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. Hi, how are you? Ambassador, I just wanted to ask you a couple of specifics and then a general question. So specifics.
Let's see if we can compress it into one question.
Sure, it's all trade related, On Indonesia, there's reporting that you are unhappy about what's happening with Indonesia. If you could give us an explanation on what's happening there and what they're trying to push back on. And what does that mean about these other agreements that you've already sort of negotiated? And are you seeing that kind of same recalcitrant attitude from other players? But then the other issue is the chips issue and the ruling that came, or the decision that was made by the president. We understand that there's some sort of pushback. Obviously, we're seeing that on the Hill yesterday in the hearing. But can you tell us your view on allowing those chips to go? Thanks.
So I'll just do the first one because you said one question.
Yeah.
So on Indonesia, we saw that report in the FT, and we have confidentiality agreements between us and Indonesia as we proceed. What I will say, I think it's meaningful that we had signed agreements at the ASEAN conference in October with Malaysia and Cambodia. I would love for Indonesia to be in that same position. I think it's a great export market. There are things we import from Indonesia that we want to import. I think that we're always ready to move forward and to move forward quickly. And I'm going to have a conversation with my counterpart in Indonesia tomorrow morning. I'm looking at my staff tomorrow morning, to talk about progress. I'd love to see that deal finished and done. I think it's in their interest and in ours.
I'm going to go to a question from the online audience. And by the way, if you are waiting to add a question, you can go to askac.org, and there will be an opportunity there if you want to ask a question. Let me see, how do I do this? Oh, it's a part where my age starts to catch up with me. I'll read I guess you can all see the question now. So.
Oh, everyone can see it. Okay.
Yeah.
So Brazil. All right. So with Brazil, we have a lot of issues going on with Brazil. Historically, they have been a challenging trade partner in a lot of ways. An important trade partner. We have a trade surplus there. A lot of good import-export trade that happens. But there are a lot of barriers to the United States: tariff, non-tariff barriers, regulatory barriers. On top of that, they're a competitor for the United States, especially in agriculture. Whenever we are trying to sell our commodities overseas, we're always competing with the Brazilians. We're concerned about some of their practices with respect to agriculture, so we're conducting a Section 301 investigation that covers a number of practices in Brazil, including what we think could be illegal deforestation in the Amazon, for their soybean production, a variety of digital practices. The president also, kind of separate from the trade world, has had foreign policy concerns with respect to the weaponization of law and judicial system in Brazil. With respect to officials in Brazil, we've seen them detain Americans. We've seen them issue secret orders to American tech companies. We're concerned with all of these. Some of these are identified in our Section 301 investigation that we're conducting. Some are identified in the executive order that empowers the State Department and others to take action. And so we essentially have a mix of tariffs on Brazil due to both trade issues and foreign policy issues. President Trump has had several very constructive interactions with President Lula recently in the process of relieving tariffs on coffee and cocoa, which we were discussing earlier. Brazil was included in that, and part of that is a recognition of progress we've made with them. We would like to, in the near term, have some kind of deal with Brazil. It may not solve every problem, but I think that there are things they can do. They seem to be quite willing partners. They're in the Western Hemisphere. You saw the national security strategy. Western Hemisphere is very important to us. We want to have a better trade relationship with them, and I think we kind of have a structure set up to do negotiations to achieve that. Of course, it takes both sides' willingness to actually make concessions.
Thanks. Yes. There. Wait for the mic and then introduce yourself.
Hi, Logan Wright, Rhodium Group. You mentioned that the administration is favoring a more constructive relationship with China at this point. Is that inconsistent with other objectives to bring down the U.S. trade deficit, given that China's strategy remains export-oriented and continuing to increase global trade surpluses? And does that reflect a change in the approach toward longer-term strategic competition with China?
So I don't think it's inconsistent at all. I mean, we've really, frankly, since May, since our Geneva talks, we've been on this path with China to be more constructive. And since May, we've seen more balance come into the relationship on the good side. So we're doing both of these things at the same time. As I mentioned earlier, I think that U.S.-China trade, I think it needs to be managed. I think we need to figure out, what do we want from you? What do we not want from you? What do you want to buy from us? And there's always going to be this, upper area of the highest tech the highest tech items, which folks have referred to and asked about, and that's always going to be some stuff obviously, and other stuff is a gray area. You have to figure that out. But there's a lot of area where we should trade with China, right? There's a lot of consumer goods or low tech items. We certainly should be selling ag and airplanes and medical devices and things like that. I mean, I think we should focus on where do we agree, where we should be trading, and what types of volumes to try to have balance. And then if there are stickier issues, we can address those down the road. I don't think it's inconsistent at all.
We're almost out of time, and I'm once going to do the moderator's prerogative to ask the last question. We heard the phrase rules-based international order so many times, but I think the only thing we all agree on now is that it's dead, is that it died sometime between 2016 and 2017, but it might have already been dying by that point. What is your vision of what replaces that order, if anything? I mean, I could have explained that when it was a WTO and nested in that were a group of bilateral and prolateral treaties. What will govern the rules of international trade going forward, if in fact there are such rules?
Well, first of all, I'd say from what I would think is a realist view, the question is, was it ever alive at all, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes we kind of have white lies we tell ourselves in international relations to paper over the actual power politics that really control everything. I would say with the WTO, it has a baseline set of commitments that were agreed to many years ago. There hasn't been a lot of development there. That's why we as the United States are layering over the WTO commitments, bilateral agreements that we believe put America's interests first, and are also in the interest of these other countries to be able to maintain access to the U.S. market in ways that are beneficial to them. So, I think we have some of those underpinnings, but where they can't, the WTO can't fix overcapacity, right? They can't even be transparent among their own members and publish notices of new rules. They can't fix overcapacity, so we're going to have to deal with that either on our own or with willing partners. So I think it's going to be interest-based.
Okay. Ambassador Greer, thank you very much. Very interesting conversation. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.